thank you so much for coming, and very much on time, which hardly happens, so I'm very impressed. So welcome to the panel, Ethics and Rights of Immigration, organized by the Cornell Institute for European Studies as part of its migration series. I'm the CIS director, Esra Akcan, and by the way, please feel free to help yourself with the food whenever you want. No need to stay hungry till the end of the panel. So the moderator of today's panel, Andre Marmor, will make the introduction, but let me say a few words about the context, because this is actually our final event in the migration series that has been continuing for the last 2 years with the generous support of the Aynadi Center's Internationalization Grant. I'm very glad to learn that the university has picked migration as a university-wide theme for next year's Grand Global Challenge, which means there will be more panels and events of this kind next year, even though CIS's own grant for this particular series is coming to a close after 2 years with this panel. So during these past 2 years, the CIS team conceptualized migration as a broader phenomenon than the immigration of people. And we looked at the migration also of images, plants, languages, technologies, objects, and so on. We organized panels on both topical and long-standing issues from historically and theoretically informed contemporary perspectives. These included the events, Academic Freedom and Exile, Will This Robot Take My Job? Migration and Automation, and Employment, of course, Migration of Images, The Arts of the Immigrant Continent, Crossing the Mediterranean, Exhibiting Yugoslavia, Global 1968, Blackout, Necropolitics of Extraction, Exiles in the 21st Century, Family Separation, Lessons from Europe's Past, The Future of EU, Immigration and the Rise of Populism, and finally today, Ethics and Rights of Immigration. With these panels, the series put Europe in its global context, both as a place of arrival and departure. It critically acknowledged Europe's role in the history of both modernization and colonization of the planet, and disclosed Europe's character as an immigrant continent. One of our goals was to create a platform for multidisciplinary discussions where scholars from different professions could stimulate new synergies. To that end, the series brought together scholars working in multiple humanities and social science disciplines, including in alphabetical order, this is a long list, but that's the point, anthropology, architecture, art history, government history, labor relations, landscape, law, philosophy, public health, sociology, and numerous literature and area studies, including British, French, German, Italian, as well as East and Central European, West and South Asian, South and North American studies, and also engineering and science and technology studies, including computer science, electrical engineering, and mechanical engineering. So we hosted a variety of speakers at all stages of their careers. So if this is the first time you're coming to our events, and if you're feeling sad that you missed so many panels on migration, you don't need to worry, because we have now uploaded videos of all the panels on our website, and I'm just showing you, so you can see all the panels, and we will have all the video recordings as well. Yeah. So I realize it's not the same as being here and participating, but I hope that the website offers a valuable archive for those who are interested in multiple aspects of migration. So finally, I would especially like to thank CIS Executive Committee for their ideas and suggestions, and our team, Alexander Perlman, Claire Svensson, as well as our student assistants, Anna, Libby, and Siming, for their organization, and our videographer, where is he? Yeah, Justin Peterson, who made it possible to watch these events afterwards. I hope we all look in the videos, we all look good in the videos. So, for today, so please join me, welcome our moderator, Andre Marmor from Cornell University of Law and Department of Philosophy.
I didn't realize that there is video. I would have changed my note. Thank you. So I want to do two things, both briefly. Introduce the speakers individually and say something about the way we thought of constructing this debate, which we hope will be a debate, philosophical, academic debate. So we have three speakers. Patty Leonard is Associate Professor of Ethics at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, though this year I understand she's visiting as a scholar researcher at the University of Toronto. Her book, entitled Trust, Democracy and Multicultural Challenges, was published in 2012. She published a whole bunch of articles on a variety of issues relating to democracy, migration. Now she's working on how democracies should punish terrorists, and I'll say a few words later about her topic today. Keith Wellman is Professor of Philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis. He works mainly in political philosophy. His work is very well known in the areas of political legitimacy, political obligation, by which we mean the obligation to obey the law, immigration, of course, and more recently, punishment, which I didn't know, I just realized now. So his recent book, 2017, is on punishment, rights and forfeiture in punishment. And he has on the topic of immigration, he has a book which is a debate with, we call Debating Ethics and Immigration, which is really a fantastic little book that gives a very good idea of the arguments in this field. And finally, Jeremy Waldron, who is sitting lonely there. It's okay, we'll keep him company later. So he's a professor at NYU. I mean, it's almost embarrassing to present Jeremy, because if you're here, you probably have read something by Jeremy on something. He is an incredibly prolific, well-known political philosopher and legal philosopher. His books are too numerous to list. If I start to read their titles, we'll run out of time. But he has written on really an amazing range of topics in political and legal philosophy, including equality, dignity, legislation, the right to private property, hate speech, toleration. We were thinking today at lunch, is there anything that Jeremy hasn't written about? And we found maybe one or two. Anyway, so speaking of lunch, we had a deliberative democracy little exercise trying to figure out how to construct our presentations today. And there is a general theme to the presentations. The theme is how robust the right of states, the power states claim to have to exclude potential immigrants from their territories, or how strong the right, if there is a right, or at least a justified claim, to enter the country, to immigrate to the country of their choosing is. So we thought that we'll start with Jeremy, who is in favor of more extended and more generous immigration policies. We'll continue with Keith, who is against, in a way, and we'll present an argument about that. And then Patty, who is not in the middle, but even if not, at least yes in this case, which is the case of refugees. So that's the structure, and we'll start with Jeremy. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Andre. I want also to thank Ezra for arranging this, and Claire Swenson, who's done a tremendous amount of work in the arrangements. So our topic is ethics and the rights of immigration. I want to talk a little bit about some background ideas and conceptions that ought to inform our thinking about migration. That's movement into various communities and out of various communities. movement across the face of the world. Our understanding, we need to think a little bit about our understanding of the division of the world into particular political communities. And we need to understand and articulate an understanding of the rhythms of movement and settlement that have characterized our history and prehistory since archaic and modern species of human beings moved out of Africa, began to move out of Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. So I want to think about the philosophical foundations of how we approach this vexed question that Andre mentioned, which is the question, do states have the right, an inherent right, to restrict immigration? You need to have some deep background. If it were up to me, we would begin with some reflections on a very deep background idea, which is the idea among humans of our common possession of the earth. A common possession of the earth. I've heard it said that a foundational account of migration needs to be rooted in the sense of our common ownership of the earth. You could put it in religious terms, God gave the world to mankind in common, starting point, say, of John Locke's theory, for example. And we have to figure out territory and community and boundaries and movement and settlement beginning from that premise. And we must do so in a way that doesn't betray that premise. What might this mean? Well, at the very least, common ownership of the earth does foundational work as the basis of our normative determination that nobody shall be stateless. We are going to divide the world into territorially defined states, territorially defined political communities. We need to make sure that that network includes everybody, that everybody has a place in that network, if network there is going to be. I think it also explains the elemental acknowledgement by many legal systems, not all, of the principle of jus soli, that is, the right that you have to live in the place where you were born, on the soil where you were born. A person has at least the right to be and remain in the place where he was born. Immanuel Kant identified original common ownership with the idea that, this is a quote from the great master, all human beings have a right to be wherever nature or chance has placed them. It helps to make sense too, I think, of something that I know Paddy is going to talk about, which is the distinctive rights of the refugee, now formalized in international law. For someone fleeing from a place that has become intolerable, there must be another place on earth that they can flee to. Common ownership also makes sense, I think, of very ancient traditions of universal hospitality to strangers, a theme in the Odyssey, in ancient Jewish tradition, a tenet of natural law since Aquinas and Vittoria, and a focus of philosophical attention in the work of people like Kant. Okay, so people wake to consciousness and find themselves in various places here, and here, and here, all over the world. But humans are not like plants or sea anemones. They don't sit rooted to the spot waiting for nutrition to wash over them. They go out in quest of a living. They go out in quest of a subsistence. We can't just stay rooted to the spot where we have an original right to be. Sometimes we seek a better, more nutritious life elsewhere. Humans move, and this earth is their home, and so they're moving, as well as they're standing fast, as a way of consummating their original right to the earth. When someone walks from, I don't know, Tijuana to Texas, or sails from Libya across the sea to Italy, she is, from one perspective, moving from one place where she has a right to be to another place where she has no right to be. And that would be the view of the law. That would be the juridical view. But in a deeper and more generous vision, her movement on the face of the earth is her movement on the face of a planet that is as much hers as anyone's. And her movement is as much a way of consummating that ownership as anyone. I'm conscious that this perspective is not for everyone, especially the theological premise that I alluded to. But theology or not, I think it's incumbent on us, and I would want to put the question to Ket and put the question to Paddy, that we have to begin somewhere with some conception of human relationship to the earth and develop our thinking about migration based on some such conception, if not this precise one. Then there's the key issue. How are we to think about the topic of movement and settlement in the human world? People moving en masse or individually for reasons of their own from one place to another, and the response that settled communities might reasonably make to such movement. I like to think in terms of a dialectic of movement and settlement. Humans are and always have been migratory animals. Our natural relation to land and territory has always included wandering as well as settlement. I don't mean we're nomads. The impression should not be given that settlement is always temporary, that pause while we gather our strength for the next migration. People move in order to settle. They have the experience and expectation of settlement conceived as permanent, something which may last as a cherished place for many generations, immemorial, and sometimes for millennia. Moreover, different people and different peoples participate in this dialectic of movement and settlement in different and overlapping periods. It's not like musical chairs where we all move and then we all settle, hopefully finding somewhere to sit. Some are settled for so long they have forgotten the dynamics that drew their ancestors to the place where they live. Immemorial settlement can generate a sort of optical illusion that makes people forget about the migratory character of our species. We are privileged, we say, to have always been the inhabitants of the soil, and that can make migration seem unusual or threatening. So there needs to be a way, at least in the foundations of our thinking about this, to recover a sense of what it was like to move, what it was like to move from one community to another. For the movements of some are disconcerting to others, challenging these others' settled feelings of entitlement, but movement is usually for reasons that have always motivated human migration: to escape danger, natural or man-made, and to secure subsistence with a less precarious way of living. It's not perverse or unnatural for humans to move in the world. It's the way we are. And again, there's a question that anybody who thinks about migration has to answer. Acknowledging the fact that humans have been migratory peoples, are we now to suppose that, normatively speaking, this is over and our people's movements have to be curtailed? What's the relationship of modern policy on immigration to this dialectic of movement and settlement? How are we to think about whether states have the right to restrict immigration? One thought is this, and I'm a political philosopher, and among the many things I write about is the work of John Locke, so I'm going to ask you to entertain a Lockean hypothetical. I want you to think of a community of people, rights-respecting individuals who own property, who have a little economy in a village, conduct agriculture, sort of a Lockean state of nature, but a social, economic state of nature, but no state, no positive law. And the people in this village who've been living there for ages, always as it seems to them, suddenly become aware that others are on the horizon and are proposing to come and settle in their vicinity. There's a book by Jim Croucher called Harvest, which gives a nice image of how disconcerting such an apprehension can be. But never mind Jim Croucher, just think about the people who live in this village and how they should respond to these newcomers coming on the horizon. Are they entitled to drive the newcomers away? Which is something presumably they could do. They could organise to throw rocks at them, to tear up their tents, to pull up their plants, driving them away from the vicinity because they feel threatened by the unfamiliarity of the outsiders. I'm not saying that they're doing this to protect their own property or to protect their own persons. I want you to imagine that they have some reasonable assurance, perhaps spoken, perhaps experiential, that those who are coming to their vicinity do not propose to rob them or prey on their possessions. They're just moving into the vicinity where there appears to be some places where you can move to. So the question is not protecting property or protecting persons. Are they entitled to protect the character of their neighbourhood in world terms? Excuse me, in terms of their own association in this neighbourhood, by throwing rocks and shouting threats and uprooting tents and driving people away because they would rather that these people not be in their neighbourhood. I'm insisting on us thinking about this first as a Lockean question about what people are entitled to do. We can come in a moment to the question about what states are entitled to do, but it's been a common theme of Lockean political philosophy that most of the powers of the state derive from the powers that individuals have. So would individuals have the right to drive people away? I know Kit will speak to us in a moment about the relationship between migration issues and freedom of association. So putting the question to him, I would ask, are people entitled to drive others away just because they would rather not associate? Yeah? No threat to property, no threat to person, just we would rather not have anything to do with it. Yeah? Is that a reasonable basis for people to drive others away from a neighbourhood? Let me be clear, there's no doubt that people are entitled to drive away bandits and marauders. An occasional rhetoric appropriate to driving out marauders is used in the immigration debate. Illegal immigrants as rapists, drug dealers, or members of M13. But in the real world, would-be immigrants, including most of those whose movement into our community is restricted, do not approach our territory with the intention of attacking our persons or stealing our stuff or driving us off our land. If they had their way, they would be just like people moving from one vicinity in our country to another vicinity in our country. They're looking to find somebody to rent property from, they're looking to find somebody to secure a job with, they're looking to deal in the relatively well-established networks of economic association in the neighbourhood. They want to make a life for themselves in our vicinity. It's a state of nature, hypothetical, that I've asked you to entertain, and we have to consider what adding a state, a sovereign, into the picture, what difference that would make. Because if your intuitions are anything remotely like mine, I'm uneasy about the proposition that a community as such has the right to just drive people away, because it would rather not have them in the neighbourhood. People say, well, of course, a state has the right to restrict immigration. Michael Walzer says that states almost by definition have a right and responsibility to control their borders. Ronald Reagan is supposed to have said that a nation that cannot control its borders isn't really a nation. There's this kind of a mantra here that people repeat over and over again. I think we need to think twice before we repeat it. One reason to pause is that the term used in these proposed definitions of the state, the right to control its borders, is ambiguous. Certainly a nation has the right to control its borders against the incursions of other countries, say by their armies, in the way that Kuwait was entitled to resist the incursion of the Iraqi army. On the other hand, many of us believe that nations do not have the right to control the passage of ideas or the movement of images or communications across their borders. Some would say that nations don't have a right to control movement of money, capital. And a country that supposedly has the right to control its borders certainly doesn't have a right to restrict immigration. I think we all accept that. That we think of as a human right. So where in this array of possible things that might not or might be comprised in the claim a sovereign state has a right to control its borders should we locate a putative right to control immigration? Is it more like a right to resist other states' armies? Or is it more like the movement of capital or ideas? What we need at this stage are arguments, not definitions. Henry Sedgwick, who, as you know, was a Victorian moral philosopher. Henry Sedgwick, in his book, The Elements of Politics in the 1890s, entertained an alternative view to the effect that the business of legal and political officials, government officials, is, and this is a quote, is to maintain order over a particular territory, but not in any way to determine who is to inhabit the territory. To maintain order within the territory, but not to determine who is to inhabit it, or to restrict the enjoyment of its natural advantages to any particular portion of the human race. Now, Michael Walzer quoted this passage, and Walzer doesn't agree with it. And Sedgwick, who mooted it, didn't agree with it either. Sedgwick thought this was a very highfalutin, cosmopolitan approach. But it's not. It's the basis on which the communities we call states in the United States organize their affairs. When I move from California to live in New York, I do so purely as a matter of my own free will. And when I move, the border is significant because now I'm subject to California, to New York law rather than to California law. So the border is important, but neither California nor New York has the right to restrict movement from one state to another. Yeah? They are Sedgwickian associations. The 50 states of the United States are Sedgwickian associations. And these are not just minor considerations. Each of these states is a semi-sovereign. Each of these states has the right to lay down law. Each of them has plenary authority, except for matters reserved to the federal government. Each of the states has more powers in many ways than the federal government. So we organized some political communities. New Jersey, New York, Indiana, Oregon, California, Texas, on the basis of free movement, but the states still have authority, which seems to me to show that we don't need a right to restrict movement in order to run a sovereign state. Well, think of this as, I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I deal in hypotheticals. Think of this example. A government has to take the population of its territory more or less as it finds it. It doesn't get to determine the size and the quality of the population, at least not directly. If there is an uptick in fertility, the government just has to handle it, even if it wasn't planning for those extra millions of subjects to it. Suppose the government suddenly discovered tens of thousands of people living in a forested area who had always been there but had never been noticed or counted. If the forests are part of that state's territory, then it simply has to adjust the demographic basis of its policy calculations. The state has responsibilities to whoever turns out to be here, whether it had planned on taking care of them or not, whether their presence was congenial to the rest of the inhabitants of the state or not. States are, in that sense, open organizations, not closed club-like associations. If time allowed, and I know I need to finish very shortly, if time allowed, I would invite you to consider a conception of political community to match what I've said about Sedgwickian associations and so on, which is that we organize political communities not to consummate what we have in common, not to consummate or highlight a nationalistic idea or a particular culture, nor do we do so in order to associate with people we find congenial. Certainly there's a long tradition in political philosophy about thinking of political communities in terms of congeniality, communities of affinity, communities of like-mindedness in various ways. But think of the philosophies of people like Thomas Hobbes and Immanuel Kant, which is that we should form political communities with those with whom we are likely to be in conflict about the resources in this area. We should form political communities with those with whom we are likely to disagree about justice, because those disagreements and those conflicts need to be sorted out, and nothing but positive law will help us to do that. So the suggestion might be that maybe even from the foundations, we should not think about political communities as like clubs or associations. They are more like, I don't know, fire brigades, which have a responsibility to put out fires in a particular territory whenever they break out. Or they are like police organizations, which have a responsibility to protect the lives of anybody in the territory, irrespective of how they got there. States have important functions to perform: resolving disputes, agreeing on a conception of justice, dividing resources. They don't all do this well, very few of them do, but that's what they have to do. And as I say, they have to do it among whoever happens to be here. And it seems to me that's one way of looking at the place of state building and political community building in relation to the dialectic of movement and settlement that I spoke about. What we have added to the history and prehistory of movement and settlement is that inasmuch as that gives rise to disputes about justice, about property, about the basis of economy, we need to set up states to resolve those disputes. But we should not think about the dialectic of movement and settlement in terms of people finding some people congenial to live with and others whose very presence offends them, even their presence in the neighborhood when they don't pose any threat. So listen, I haven't offered any particular policy conclusion. I'm a serial migrant. I was born in New Zealand, I settled in England, I came to California, settled in New York. I went back rather recently for 5 or 6 years back to Oxford in England. I held green cards. I had a whole fistful of green cards from different communities. So maybe it's natural that I would be searching for foundations that are congenial to the rights of migrants. But I hope you will accept that I haven't been working on these foundations just in order to generate a immigrant-friendly philosophical conception. It seems to me, just to reiterate, anybody thinking responsibly about these matters, especially in the context of a discussion of ethics and political philosophy, has to think, number one, about the primal relation of each human being to the planet. Number two, to this dialectic of movement and settlement, which has always characterized human affairs. Number three, about the rights of communities to drive away those they find simply uncongenial. And number four, about the basis of political community and why we form political communities and whether that requires us to drive people away. So, as they say in the Godfather movies, do me a favor and take this into consideration. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
I want to begin, like Jeremy, by thanking Andre and the others for the invitation. It's a thrill to be here. Never been to Cornell before. Appreciate you hosting me on such a beautiful day. It's a special treat to get to be on a panel with Patty and Jeremy on what I think is a very important topic. So, Jeremy, that was gorgeous. It was really beautiful. And I'm going to try and take up the challenge. So I think Jeremy and I agree in general on a lot in political philosophy. And even when it comes to migration, we agree on a lot, but we have a really stark difference in terms of political self-determination and what its implications are. And so let me take up his challenge. I agree with him that in the state of nature, absent some kind of argument to the contrary, anyone may go anywhere on the globe. There are three types of rights which might explain why someone has a right to exclude you. First is occupancy rights, second is property rights, and the third is rights to political self-determination. I don't know, but I suspect that Jeremy and I conceive of occupancy rights similarly, which is, in general, they don't justify exclusion. So what you have is you've got in the state of nature, which is to say a pre-political environment, you've got folks hanging out, living in harmony, and they have an occupancy right, which means that they have a right to stay there. No one may forcibly evict them. But that, in and of itself, isn't exclusionary. So if someone else is going to come along, they don't get to exclude them. Now, there might be circumstances in which an occupancy right would give the people who were there first, call them the Sooners, the right to exclude. Imagine that these people, it could only, the habitat that they reside on can only comfortably sustain 100,000 people. Up to 100,000 people, no one can be excluded. Then after that point, they can exclude folks. But that's a limiting case, and I think that's not what we're arguing about. Second of all, you imagine this community, and some new folks are coming. Can we throw sticks at them, stones at them, do all kinds of things? No, right? But if you believe that there are pre-institutional property rights, whatever your account of property rights are, if you've got a hut, say, that you own, then I think you have a right to exclude these people. You can't say, oh, you can't live amongst us. You can't say, you may not live in this area that we habitat, that we reside in. But if someone's coming to your door and she's going to come into your living room, if you've got a genuine property right to it, then you may say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to come in here. And if you need to, you can use proportionate force, including maybe throwing rocks. Okay? I think Jeremy and I agree about that. The third type of argument for a right to exclude has to do with political self-determination. And here's where Jeremy said, you didn't have it in the state of nature, so you owe me some kind of story about why you have it once you formed a political state. And in my remaining time, I'm going to give you that story. The story has three core premises. The first is that legitimate states are entitled to political self-determination. The second is freedom of association is an integral component of self-determination. so that if you're not afforded freedom of association, you're not fully self-determined. And the third is freedom of association includes the right not to associate, to refuse to associate with prospective associates. Now the second and third are easy. I can get those really quickly. The real action's on the first one, the first premise. So let me explain the second and third. Imagine that your father has the right to choose your marital partner. Now in my case, my father is much wiser than I. And he could do a much better job, and my life might go better. So whatever you think about it, maybe it'd be good for Kit, maybe it wouldn't. But it's clear that there'd be a very important sense in which my life was not self-determined. And most of us recoil at the idea that I don't get to choose my marital partner, right? Freedom of association is not just the right to get married. It's the right to refuse prospective suitors, even all of them, if I want to remain single, right? And the idea that my father or the state or some religious leader could say, no, Kit, you're going to marry her or him. Again, whatever merits it might have, it's clear that it would deny me the right to freedom of association, and it would deny me my right to self-determination. For those of us who hold self-determination dear, this is one of the reasons that we say, no, people get to choose their associates. That much I think is relatively straightforward. Why think that corporate political entities like states have a right to political self-determination? I'll take Jeremy's home state of New Zealand, in which he was born. Imagine that Australia said to New Zealand, really impressed with what you've been doing recently. We'd like to merge with you, form one state. Nothing wrong with that invitation.
There's a clause in the Australian Constitution just to that effect.
If New Zealand held a plebiscite and said, yeah, and the majority voted in favor of the union, great, let them join together, just like East and West Germany do, right? But imagine that New Zealand holds a plebiscite and the majority says, no, you're great. It's us, not you. You're great, but we'd rather not merge with you. May Australia say, okay, well, we're going to forcibly annex you? I think not. I think that would be impermissible. I think that wrongly disrespects the citizens of New Zealand. And I think the citizens of New Zealand collectively are entitled to be political self-determination in virtue of their status as a legitimate political state. Right? If New Zealand was like Somalia and human rights weren't being satisfactorily protected, and Australia said, we got to go in and take things over so that people are protected here, I would not object. Because Somalia is not a legitimate state. Right? If New Zealand was like Milosevic's Yugoslavia, and Australia said, I'm sorry, we got to come in here because although you're able, you're unwilling to satisfactorily protect the human rights of your constituents, right? I wouldn't object. But New Zealand is neither a failed nor a rogue state. New Zealand does an exemplary job of protecting the human rights of its constituents. It's a legitimate state, and it's entitled to political self-determination. So here's what I want to say. If Australia needs permission to merge with New Zealand, why doesn't any given Australian need permission before she joins New Zealand? Right? Why doesn't New Zealand as a group get to decide, we're going to decide whether or not we want to let anyone into our political community? And here I want to correct something that Andre said at the beginning. Andre mentioned that Jeremy's interested in open borders and Kit's the opposite. That's not true. I'm not advocating closed borders. I would prefer that our borders were more porous. But what I'm unapologetically defending today is the right of legitimate states to close their borders. In other words, legitimate states like New Zealand get to choose for themselves. I would advocate more open borders. But if New Zealand said, we don't want to allow anybody in, right, then I believe they're entitled to do so, just as each of you is entitled to say, I don't want to marry anyone. Okay? So it seems to me that you can make a straightforward case for legitimate political states having a right to political self-determination, which includes the right to determine who's in the political community and who's not. All right. 2 quick potential objections. One is you want to say, look, Kit, your analogy between marriage and citizenship is totally inapt because marriage is so intimate, it's so important, right? Whereas you don't even know, right? I mean, Jeremy comes and goes, I don't know whether he's in the country or not, okay, at the time. And so it's an inapt analogy. And I want to say, not fair, right? It's not an equivalence, it's an analogy. And it's true that it's not as intimate, and it's true that any given individual coming into a country is not going to have as dramatic effect. But this just shows that whatever presumptive right there is to control immigration is going to be, at best, less strong, at most less strong, right? Less weighty, and might be defeated. The second thing is you might say that, oh no, corporate political entities like New Zealand have a right to exclude Australia as a whole, but not individuals. But notice we don't think this about groups in general, right? If I'm impressed with Cornell and say, I think I'm going to assign myself a position on the faculty at Cornell tomorrow, right? I don't get to do that, right? Cornell gets to decide whether or not to hire me. Cornell gets to decide whether or not my child will come here, if she applies, right? And again, the way freedom of association works, I can't be conscripted to the faculty. Jeremy was on the faculty here for a year. After this presentation, people might be clamoring to get him back. They don't, the way freedom of association works is both sides have to agree. Finally, I know I'm running out of time. Let me say 2 things. That's just a presumptive case. And you might say, fine, that's presumptive, but it gets outweighed. When you look, for instance, at the egregious distributive injustice, right? When you look at the difference between the way Canadians are able to live versus Chadians, when, you know, people in Canada were just lucky enough to be born in Canada and people in Chad were just unlucky enough to be born in Chad, you're fetishizing self-determination to say that Canada is allowed to put guns at the borders and keep Chadians out, okay? I agree with everyone on this panel that the status quo is a moral abomination. What I deny is that these duties of international distributive justice have to come in the currency of open borders, okay? Think about Bill and Melinda Gates. They got a lot of money, right? None of us thinks, okay, they got so much money, Kit gets to join the family. No, we think maybe they have duties to transfer some of the money. And as long as they can transfer the money, right, then they retain their rights to freedom of association, including the right to refuse to associate with Kit. We should do the same thing internationally, right? I'm all for the idea that Canada and other wealthy Western governments must do much, much more. And I have no objection if what they want to do is open their borders. But if they want to jealously protect their borders, then they have to do much more than they're currently doing to help the global poor where they are. They need to make transfers. Finally, I want to talk about refugees very quickly. It looks like you can't make that argument. It looks like, oh, okay, fine, you know, in general, international duties of distributive justice can be kept separate from the rights of freedom of association, right, because of transfers. But refugees are people who need refuge. They have to be let in, all right? And even here, I think that's false. I think I agree that there are stringent and demanding duties to refugees, and I certainly think that we're not doing enough. But again, it's not clear that what we're doing has to come in the currency of open borders, even for refugees. So you have to make sure that these refugees have refuge. But that could be in some other country, or it could even be in their home country, and it might be preferable that it be in their home country. So I'll close with this example, right? Before the 2003 US-led incursion into Iraq, right, under Bush 1, there were concerns about Saddam's Ba'athist regime persecuting, in fact, gassing the Kurds in northern Iraq. One of the things you could have done is say to the Kurds, you're being persecuted, let's come and we'll give you refuge here in the United States. But another thing you can do, which we did do, is said, we're going to create a safe haven where you are. We're going to create a no-fly zone to make sure that you don't have to move and you have refuge in northern Iraq, okay? And so those are the types of things that you can do. And again, I'm not advocating that you should do it. I'm not advocating saying, look, this is the way we get to close borders, right? Because I'd like to have more open borders. But I'm just saying that there's a right to close your borders as long as you discharge your duties in other ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm different because I have a PowerPoint, which is right here.
That's the difference. I knew there was.
There's a difference. Look at that. I also have my own timer.
That excludes me.
So I'll join. I'm a walker. I walk. So I'll try to talk loud when I move away from this thing, but I can't help it. I tried to help it. I can't help it. I will join my fellow panelists in thanking everybody for including me on this panel, for making it easy to get here, and this does not include my time.
Limited range though. So.
Okay, all right, okay. Join my panelists in thanking everybody for coming, for including me, etc. And we conceived this the order of talks at lunch, and Andre reported it more or less accurately. Jeremy's pro movement, Kit's slightly less pro, depending on how you heard what he said, anti movement, or at least defends the right of states to control borders. And my intervention, I'm not a Goldilocks, actually, and in fact, I suffer from being a philosopher who works in a public policy school. So I operate at the intersection of ideal political theory, what ought we to do, what is the best thing to do, and what do we do given the real circumstances that we face in the world. And so as a result, I will give you a talk in which I talk about one specific category of migrants, that is to say refugees, and a related category of migrants, which is to say asylum seekers, people who are seeking refuge but have not yet been granted refuge. And I'm going to try to place them into the political theory that you've already heard, to try to explain why it is, in fact, Kit is wrong, which is to say that there are some cases in which there is no way to discharge the duty that we have towards refugees where they are, and so therefore there will be a whole range of cases, far more than I think he might allow, in which admission is the only solution, the only way in which to remedy the situation that refugees pose. So that's what I'll do. So I've titled my talk, Refugees and Just Admissions for What? And as I go forward in the talk, I will say something about the political theory, the political philosophy of refugees and how it's been treated, and why I think it doesn't capture the full set of questions we need to ask. And I'll say something about how I think that applies given the conditions that we face today. So who are refugees? Again, so I haven't been 100% sure who's in my audience, so just so we're all talking about the same categories of people, refugees are people who have crossed borders in search of safety, and they are fleeing war or persecution. There's all kinds of definitions. That's the one I'm going to use. Asylum claimants are individuals who are seeking refuge. So they appear at a border and they say, I am unsafe, I am the victim of persecution, and I need a new home, I need refuge, and please, you should let me in, right? So there are two categories. People who are definitely, we've agreed that they need safety, and people who are requesting safety. The philosophical problem, the philosophy of refugees, for those of you who are not versed in this, used to be really boring. In 2010 was the first time I started to work on this, because it was super boring, right? There's a question, do states have an obligation to admit refugees? Yes, that was it. That was the full set of philosophical questions. And there's a sort of a slight cottage industry and who counts as a refugee, whether we had the right definition of who should count, whether it should be made more expansive or narrower. But then it switched, and this is when this happened maybe about 12 years ago. That philosophers started to talk about not whether we had a duty to admit refugees, to which the answer was yes, but whether, given that there are so many refugees, I'll describe the world as I see it in a moment, the details of this. But since there are so many refugees, actually what we need to think about as a global space is what is our fair share of duties. Ours are Canadian by origin, American by marriage, and Hungarian by, I want to say genetics, not genetics. And, what's that?
Descent.
By descent. I do carry the passport, not as valuable as it used to be. In any case, people talk about what is the fair share of refugee protection, right? So I'm Canada. Here I am as a representative of Canada. What does Canada have to do? How many people do we have to admit? How much money should we send to refugee camps, to urban centers that are homes to refugees, etc.? What is the fair share? The typical way in which this is talked about is in terms of admissions. How many people do we need to admit? Nobody comes to Canada's borders as a refugee, very small numbers of people. And what kind of resources do we have? Two types of resources. How much money can, as a country, Canada, or if you prefer as the United States, send abroad to refugee camps to support other spaces there, to create safe havens for Kurds, for example? And what is the capacity to integrate people who come to the country, right? What is the capacity of Canada to welcome newcomers, of the United States to welcome newcomers, compared to, for example, Hungary, which you might think has a lower capacity. There might be reasons why it has a lower capacity. You might not think they're good ones. So I'm going to talk about admissions specifically, although that's only part of the story. And this is the context in which I'm going to talk about refugee admissions. Here it is. There's 22 million refugees as of yesterday, excluding 5 million Palestinians, so 27 if you include them. They're mostly living in underfunded refugee camps or urban centers without access to services. At any one time, this will become important, the UNHCR designates 1 million of those people as in urgent need of resettlement. These are people who have no prospects of returning home to their country, and they have no prospects of being integrated into their country of refuge. Right? So people who leave, LGBTQ persons who leave Uganda to move to Kenya, right? It's not that safe for those people in Kenya either, so those people are in urgent need of resettlement. They cannot return to Uganda where they would be killed, or they'd be liable to be killed, and they can't stay in Kenya because people aren't that much more open to LGBTQ persons there either, okay? So, of those 1 million individuals who at any one time are on the UNHCR lists of designated refugees, between 100 and 150,000 find a resettlement space in a third country. So that is not very big. So this is a big problem. We are facing a big problem. In fair share discussions, in the political theory of refugees and fair share discussions, scholars make assumptions about what the right to asylum is. I arrive at your door, I'm in need of safety, or I claim that I'm in need of safety, and philosophers are all over the map about what actually is happening, what's going on. So, for example, these are two very well-known philosophers. One says there's a duty on states to settle refugees. Another one, David Owen, says the brackets are not mine, they're in the piece that I'm quoting. The states have a duty to offer presumptively temporary refuge. But, and this is the philosophical claim that I want to make here today, if you want to understand what fair shareness means, how do you identify what a fair share of refugee protection is, you got to sort this out. Because actually, if you're settling someone, or if you're offering them temporary refuge, that would have a big impact on this calculation, the algorithm that goes into determining what is Canada's fair share or the American fair share. Here's my account. 1, if you come to the border claiming your right to asylum, you have 3 things. You get 3 things. It has 3 components. 1, the right to have your claims heard. I am in danger. You have the right to have your claims heard. And you have the right, if you are in danger, not to be sent back to the country from which you came. Number 2, you have a right to temporary refuge. Right? You are definitely unsafe. You definitely need security. You can come in, and for a short period of time, you can stay here. And third, that short time must be constrained in time, because what is existentially the hardest thing about being in refuge, in a temporary state of refuge, is not knowing when that temporariness will end. So I think the right to asylum has these 3 parts. It gives rise to these 4 duties. philosophers like to talk about in rights and what types of duties they impose. Here they are. The duty to admit and adjudicate. Somebody comes to your border and says, I'm in need. You must admit them and adjudicate their claim. This is a near absolute duty on all states. Number 2, the states have duties to offer temporary refuge. In my view, I can say more about this. I think this is effectively the requirement to offer a set of rights which are equivalent to those of citizens in the state for the duration of that temporariness. This is partly because refugees are special types of migrants. I can say more about that. The duty to resettle. The duty to resettle is the one that I think people confuse. This is one of many possible duties a state could have as part of the fair share allocation scheme. When Kit was talking about how we have duties to we can fulfill our duties to refugees by creating safe havens abroad. I think that what he's thinking about is the duty to resettle. We don't have the requirement to admit and resettle individuals. And then we have the duty of resettlement. And that is the set of duties, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, that you take on if you agree to resettle someone. Or you agree to resettle someone, you go over, this is what Canada does, it takes airplanes, goes to Uganda, it says, or it goes to the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, and it says, okay, you are coming with us, let's go. And you come to Canada in the middle of February, but you're entitled, as a matter of right, to a winter jacket. Right? Canada has a duty to give you a winter jacket. Can't just bring you and say, well, you're safe in Canada, that's really nice here. You need a winter jacket. I refer to that because some of you may have seen Canada's proudest moment in recent history was of our Prime Minister Trudeau giving winter jackets to Syrian refugees arriving in the fall of 2015. It was very exciting. Okay, if you haven't seen that picture, send me an email and I will send it to you. Okay, so notice about those 4 duties that I did not say that one state has to provide them all. They can be distributed among states. So one state can have the duty to admit and to offer temporary refuge. Another one might have the duty to resettle and so on. Okay, here they are. So just a little bit more about each of these duties. States must admit any person at their border claiming asylum and consider their claim. They may not send people back to states where they are fearful for their lives. And it is absolute and it is near absolute and must be prioritized over fair share obligations. Right? So in this case, when you say, look, there was an algorithm. We determined that Canada's fair share was X. We might have said that. Somebody comes to the border and says, I'm in need of refuge. You have to consider my claim. Canada can't say, according to the algorithm, we did our fair share, so sorry, you're out of luck. It must admit. So even if you're persuaded by fair share allocations of refugee support, the requirement to admit and consider a claim trumps that. The duty of temporary refuge is the provision and protection of rights that are more or less equivalent to those offered to citizens. This is complicated because it is complicated by the reality of where refugees are, which is to say they're not really necessarily in states like Canada. So they're actually in states where basic human rights are themselves not respected, right? They're in Kenya, they're in Jordan, they're in countries where basic human rights are often not protected. So there's a lot of discussion to be had here about how what those kinds of states have to do with refugees in their midst. The duty to resettle, I think this is the philosophical money is here, which is to say some states may prefer to export justice. Kit will recognize that as taken directly from his well-known article on this topic. But some states prefer to export justice to create safe havens, to send money to Kakuma, for example. But and you might say that so long as resettling needs, which is to say so long as the million people on the UNHCR list find resettlement, maybe that's fine. Though you might say it's a permissible option, but it's still a kind of a yucky one, right? So one of the reasons that Kit gets into trouble is because people think he's saying that refugees or immigrants are kind of, like people can exclude them if they think they're yucky. And so he gets into trouble in that space, which is not his view exactly. He can defend himself, I'm sure, right? But so the general question about whether a state could say, I've done my fair share, and my fair share is I prefer 100% to export justice, not let a single refugee in. That's a permissible option under some conditions, even if we think it's a yucky one and motivated by the wrong kinds of things. Finally, the duty of resettlement. This is the winter jacket, right? If a state says, fine, we will resettle refugees. Canada took in approximately 25,000 people last year. That is a very teeny number. Then if you take them in, you have to give them a winter jacket. And you have to... I have 6 minutes left according to my phone. And my phone is never
I feel
on.
excluded.
It's the duty of resettlement. So you have to give them a phone, but you have to teach them the language. And you have to make sure that they have a place to stay. You can't just drop people off in the middle of downtown Ottawa and say, here, look, here's the tulips and here's the canal. You have to actually help them. And in my view, this is the duty here is to protect people against social deprivation. So if a state is systematically admitting people who are refugees for resettlement and not giving them the foundations they need to be a successful member of the community, they're failing here. So there's a problem, right? Here's a problem. Here's a problem. I think I've given you the exact right way to understand how we should think about refugees and the duties that we have to admit, resettle, consider their claims, and so on. But you might say, well, you just put up a really big a slide that said that there's 22 million refugees and 1 million of them are designated for resettlement, and already we're only talking about 100,000 people who find a resettlement spot to begin with. What should we do about that? Are there ways to prioritize some people for admission over others, given that having described an ideal system for fair share allocation, nobody's playing along, right? So here it is. Yes, I think that the answer is we should prioritize people who are most vulnerable. In particular, I have a definition of vulnerability, which we can discuss if you're interested. But here's the sort of the basics of it. We should identify refugees as among the most vulnerable if they lack the ability to live a minimally decent life while in temporary refuge because of the conditions that pertain in the states that offer it. So that is to say that people who are in Kenya, who are LGBTQ, they simply cannot live a minimally decent life in Kenya. They just can't. They should be prioritized. Women with many, many children who don't have a male protector in many Middle Eastern countries simply cannot live a minimally decent life in a refugee camp. They just can't. They're going to be asked to engage in sex work. They're not going to be able to provide for their children. They're going to be unsafe. Those are people who should be prioritized. So that's the general thought. You might say, I have 3 minutes. You might say, well, aren't the most vulnerable individuals the most costly to resettle? Because here's another set of people who find challenges in refugee camps or in urban centers that are not that welcoming to refugees, people with medical conditions, people with physical ailments of all kinds. Maybe you think to yourself, well, those people are really costly, and if you insist on this vulnerability criterion for admission, actually the total number of people who are going to find resettlement spots is going to go down. Right? Maybe that's what you're thinking. So what we should actually do is prioritize for resettlement the able-bodied men or the able-bodied individuals, or the English-speaking and French-speaking individuals to Canada, because they're going to integrate more quickly. Then at least more people will get off the list, right? Fewer people end up being refugees. So you might say. And I do not think we should do that. I think we should stick to our guns and prioritize, above all else, in this deeply, deeply imperfect world, that we should prioritize admission according to vulnerability. You can ask me about this if you'd like. I will deny, in fact, that they are the most costly and, in the first place. So I will deny that. So here's my conclusion. 4 parts. Fair share discussions about refugee protection, mired in ambiguity because the right to asylum is not fleshed out. It has 3 parts. I said those: a right to admission, a right to temporary refuge, and a right to a permanent solution. The right imposes these duties to admit and adjudicate the duty of refuge, the duty to resettle, and the duty of resettlement, and these are 4 distinct things. The latter 3 are subject to fair share considerations, but the first is not. And finally, given the fact of highly scarce resettlement spots, vulnerability is the correct prioritization criterion for resettlement. Thank you for your patience. He's just apologized to me. I didn't actually go over.
Okay, so let's change the setting here. Yes, Jeremy. Now I know that usually we just open it up for questions, but again, part of our deliberative democratic deliberation at lunch, we thought that if we can structure the discussion a little bit, that might be helpful. So, it seems to me that, and I hope you guys agree, feel free to correct me, that there are two big issues that come up here in the trio presentations. One is the question of the distinction, the difference, different moral considerations between self-governance and self-determination, and the question whether they come apart and what justifies moving from one to the other. So issues we haven't touched on and are, for example, questions of the value of nationalism and national solidarity and things like that that we often associate with self-determination, and at least according to Jeremy, I think not necessarily part of what we would consider self-governance. So we should probably take about half of the time, or maybe less, if you have questions about this aspect of the discussion. And then the second aspect would be about duties of international justice and treatment of refugees and others. Please, questions on the first topic. Sure, Iman, go ahead.
Thank you, this was a lovely panel. So I just have a slight tweak on Jeremy's Lockean hypothetical state of nature, because I think it might help me see how weighty you view this right to the earth and right to travel. I asked this question from a place of cosmopolitanism myself. So imagine the slight tweaks are as follows. The state of nature is expanded across, so it includes everyone on the planet, and let's stipulate that they're all angels. And by that I mean they have no desire to hurt people, they actually have a basic commitment to securing basic liberties and distributive justice at a global scale. This connects to the legitimate state idea. And I take it the first thing these angels do is they set up a super state that secures the basic liberties, secures some basic amount of distributive justice. But then they encounter the following fact, and I'm stipulating that this is the nature of these angels. They have different tastes in music and in food, and they have different intellectual tastes. Some of them think you should spend all your time doing philosophy, others want to do physics and mathematics. And they discover when the state comes to asking the question, how should we decentralize decision-making authority, how should we form these governmental sub-state institutions, they discovered that instead of populating the globe with Sedgwickian associations, that actually the general welfare maximizing form of association is much more restrictive on travel. And the reason they think this is general welfare maximizing is not just that it promotes pain and pleasure, promotes pleasure, minimizes pain, it realizes the goods that people care about. Art and music and food and science to a maximum degree, within the constraints of securing distributive justice for all and the basic liberties. Do you think that the superstate would be within its moral authority to set up non-Sedgwickian associations on those grounds, that it's general welfare maximizing?
No. The movement, I think, that would have to be restricted on that association is a matter of fundamental right.
Okay.
Yeah, and if it's a matter of fundamental right, it doesn't matter how many people's preferences would be satisfied by restricting it. You can no more do that than you could do dragoon people into various religions that they don't believe in, just because that would better satisfy the preferences. So, I mean, you've made a weak case because utilitarianism, particularly preference-based welfarist utilitarianism.
I didn't mean the preference satisfaction, I meant the good. I meant goods like beautiful art,
yes,
beautiful music, beautiful, delicious food.
Yes. No, the food channel basis and the museum-based account, I think, would be very similar. Think of the rights that we would not allow to be dominated by goods in that way, yeah, of which there are many. It may well be that people could produce much better art to populate the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art if a certain amount of torture were allowed, because otherwise you don't get the old masters producing suffering. Some of the best art is based on the artist's awareness of the suffering in the communities that they live in. But no one but a madman would think that this would justify that sort of restriction. Or maybe we think that much better art would be produced and maybe better cooking also if people were involuntarily prevented from living with their loved ones or families in the way that South African economy maintained restrictions on family unity during apartheid. Again, it would be preposterous to refer to a consequentialist justification for that. So then the onus is on someone who takes this position that I've been articulating to explain why the business of movement is to be regarded in the same category as fundamental rights. And you know, that's a big task to perform, but I don't think any doubt is thrown on it by the example that you give us.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I'm wondering, thinking about some of the biggest, the largest migration controversies today are in territories that are populated by national minorities. And so I'm thinking of Catalonia and I'm thinking of Quebec, are the two places. And it leads me to wonder, actually, in Professor Bowman's way of presenting that third duty, the right to self-determination, which I completely agree with on the one hand. But it leads me to think about the state system as it currently exists, which is just full of states whose borders are unjustly drawn. And to such a degree that I'm wondering why the state, or to what extent in your view, it's the state that has the right to establish its borders. And if it's not the state, does your view, well, I won't say that you're going to tell me it unravels, but wouldn't your view unravel a bit? I mean, I start thinking about the territories of national minorities, indigenous peoples, but then I start thinking of, you know, cities or, you know, where people want, they have a particular project going on. So how far am I supposed to be, I mean, tell me when I should stop thinking in this way. Because I don't see how it stops, to tell you the truth.
Good. So let me say two things very quickly and then I'll let you press. All right. First is I don't think states are entitled to political self-determination. I think legitimate states are entitled to political self-determination. If there's an existing state whose boundaries are unjustly drawn, then that's a reason to question its legitimacy. Right? So I don't think that a state has dominion over territory to which it has no moral claim. Secondly, I'm receptive to rights of cultural self-determination of the Quebecois, things like this. And so even though I think that legitimate political states are entitled to political self-determination, that's compatible with there being rights of cultural self-determination, which might also include exclusive elements. So when I was thinking of going to McGill, it was explained to me that my children moving in would have to go to a French-speaking school if they went to a public school. I'm not sure that's unjust. I'm not sure that's problematic. I don't have the details, but I'm in general sympathetic to there being cultural groups having rights of cultural self-determination.
I have sort of a variation of the first question and a variation of the second question. The variation of the first question is a non-utilitarian version, right? Jeremy, you imagine these two communities, right? The community that turns up has as much as good as the current community, right? But their entry into that community will diminish that, right? So you might say, you don't need to come here. Why come here? You've got as much as good over there. Leave us alone. Right? For kids, I just wondered about the, in our world, I mean, I sort of agree with you about self-determination against the background of distributive justice and legitimate states. But we know that the history of the boundaries that are now constituted states was a history of forced fraud and theft, genocide, exploitation, and so on. There's not much reason to believe that the current states, if we try to reconstruct them on some principled basis, would satisfy criteria of legitimacy, at least with respect to the way they they police people's life prospects, right? I mean, so, you know, I'm a Canadian, not a Chadian, right? You know, I won the birth lottery, you know, to be here. But the birth lottery is great salience in light of the way in which colonialism, historical injustice has carved up the world. So in our world, right, as opposed to a fictional world of legitimate states, I wonder whether your view doesn't push you much closer to Patty's view on the ground. I mean, I pretty much agree with what Patty has to say, so.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, let's move.
No.
Sure.
Sure. I mean, I'm a Sedgwickian about these things, and I don't see that states are entitled to interrogate the reasons that people have for moving from one place to another. So when I moved from California to New York, no official of the state of New York said, you know, is your journey really necessary? Do you need to do this? We just regard it as an elementary part of personal rights to be able to make this move for any reason or no reason at all. I mean, I agree with Patty that the urgent rights of those fleeing danger need to be put into very special categories, and we need to be constantly thinking and rethinking about how we conceive of that danger and how we administer that. But I'd say just one other thing, because it goes to what Kit said about self-determination. I'm going to now use the example of my wife because she's an American citizen and I'm not. But when she moved from California to New York, she moved from one self-determining unit to another self-determining unit. She ceased to have the right to vote in California. She acquired the right to vote in New York by her residence. So it's not true that closed borders are necessary for self-determination. And I'm still waiting to hear the argument why a state can't be self-determining as among those who happen to be within its borders, settled at any particular point of time, why that's necessary for self-determination, except perhaps in the question-begging sense of some analogy to the marriage example or to other corporate examples. But in terms of political self-determination, in a lot of the work that I've done, I've tried to think that political self-determination is not the self-determination of a nation or a culture or a people. It's a self-determination of those who happen to be in a certain territorially defined unit. How they got there, whether they asked permission to be there is a separate question.
So 3 things. I agree with everything Patty said. I don't understand anything about my position to deny anything that she says. We might quibble about a few descriptive things. So my big move is that our duties of international justice are disjunctive, right? And you don't have to do it in terms of open borders. You can do it in other ways. If she can come back with a case with, hey, here's a case where the only way you can help someone is by letting her in your border, then I'll say, fine, right? You have to let her in your border. I'm not denying duties, all right? And so it might be some interesting cases we might go back and forth, but I don't disagree with anything Patty said. Second of all, thank you for allowing me to repeat this. The status quo was a moral abomination, and nothing that I said should be understood as a defense of the status quo and the way current states have historically operated and the way they currently operate. So don't mistake anything I said as a validation of Donald Trump and his policies or anything like that, okay? So you're quite right. If you start taking in the history of colonization and duties, you know, we'd have to do an enormous amount more. The interesting thing becomes then, at what point does it have to be in terms of open borders? And that's where I bet I would push back on. Third of all, it's true that we have administrative units like California and New York, which function perfectly well despite being unable to exclude other compatriots, right? But it's also true that they lack self-determination that the unit as a whole has.
I want to insert a good question to you.
Absolutely.
So, a lot of the argument depends on how we understand the right to call it freedom of association.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's one thing that I think we can all agree on. that it's a right that is limited and circumscribed in many contexts. And we would think rightly so. You know, boys clubs were fine up to a point. We don't own the thing that they are most. And things like that. So why wouldn't that principle apply to states as well? So you say, okay, you have some right of association. You can determine certain aspect of the character of the country up to a point. And that point doesn't necessarily have to be when absolutely miserable refugees knock on your door. It can be when people like Jeremy Lee, radical cosmopolitans, come in and say, no, we actually want to question your premises.
So I'm not an absolutist about freedom of association. I'm not an absolutist about any right, okay, including torture, things like this. So I'm not an absolutist about freedom of association. And so then it becomes an interesting question about whether the legitimate political community's right to freedom of association is outweighed. And we could go case by case. One case where I think it is outweighed is in the case of family reunification. And what's important there is it's not that I think that family reunification is more pressing or more urgent than asylum seekers, but I think there's no way for people who want to reunite to be helped elsewhere. There has to be a union, okay? So we could go case by case, and you're right, it's a presumptive right, which is vulnerable to being defeated. And then we could talk about potential cases. And one case where it is defeated is, in my view, family reunification.
Can I ask a question to Patty? Because, I mean, this is a very powerful presentation, and a lot of it was a good, strong presentation of what the law requires as a matter of the international law on the matter. As you know, the refugee law evolves over time, and we think, first of all, of people with a well-founded fear of persecution. Increasingly, in the practice of refugee law, we've considered fleeing from war, even if there's no specific persecutory element, to be roughly equivalent. Do you think it's possible to hold the line somewhere beyond that and draw a sharp distinction between the law relating to refugees and the law relating to desperate economic migrants? Because it seems to me that one problem with the emphasis on refugee law is that we tend to be saying if you're merely an economic migrant, never mind that what you're fleeing is starvation or the land sinking from underneath you in a time of climate change. If you're a desperate economic migrant, you're not going to necessarily get the benefit of this scheme. I know you weren't saying anything remotely like that, but a lot of people do, and they justify the scheme. They claim that this line can be held, and I'm skeptical that it ought to be held. I think that we ought to pay attention to those who are in dangers of all sorts, danger of persecution, danger of war, danger of starvation.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, so, I mean, the truth of the matter is, my family's Jewish, and that has a lot to do with why I think persecution is a good grounds for admitting refugees or still identifying categories of refugees. So just to the extent that political theory is autobiography, that's what I like the persecution category. But to answer your question more specifically, I think that what refugees are distinct. The reason that they're distinct is because there's only one category of solution which can work for them, which is admission, either to temporary or permanent refuge. And I think in the case of economic migrants, people who are fleeing desperate poverty, there is another range of solutions. And I think the danger of including them in the category refugee is that we lose sight of the alternative solutions that are available and that we should be making, that we should be focusing on and that we have duties of justice to focus on.
So this is close to Kit's
So that
position.
makes me closer to the way that Kit described it, which is that there's a category of, and I feel similarly about climate migrants. There's a big movement in refugee studies to include climate movers in the category of refugees, but I think that risks failing to understand what climate movers are, and climate movers might have an additional right to be resettled as a group, because they're not just losing safety, they're losing the community which they had, which itself was not under any type of pressure. They just are all, their entire, choose your favorite community that is suffering from this, their entire island is going underwater, and so they may be owed something additional to additional beyond simply admission. And similarly for economic migrants, they might actually be owed a reconstruction of their institutions so that their institutions can serve their needs in a country where they prefer to reside, which might be some other place, in an elsewhere place.
Even if the children are hungry right now.
Even if the children are hungry right now. It's not to say that they shouldn't be admitted, it's to say that there's a wider range of solutions to the challenges that they pose than are available to refugees.
Yes,
I guess this is basically feel free. It seems to me that self-determination involving association can be a more or less serious matter. For instance, if it's a matter of who you marry that's deeply abhorrent to what we are and is going to be. If it's a matter of who gets to eat in your restaurant, I don't think it's a serious matter. It's readily overridden by people's desires to be able to have meals that are paid to them without being checked out by the owner. Now, the right not to be amalgamated one raised the connection with Australia and New Zealand. That strikes me as a serious matter, becoming part of a polity with different people, different political histories, profoundly disorienting affiliations and expectations that people rely on in representative democracy. On the other hand, there's no such disorientation if some people enter your country, a flood, with a very different cultural, political background might, but some strikes me as like the restaurant owner. But if it's like the restaurant owner, then the needs of would be entrance that make it wrong to exclude need to be especially serious. Some significance, but they need to be especially serious if they're not for the restaurant would-be customers. So, are we disagreeing? If we're not, I expect that we conceded, just to guess, all that Shirley had.
We're not disagreeing that much, but I'm not conceding as much as you think. So, first of all, you're absolutely right that freedom of association seems as though it's morally weightier in some contexts than others. So the presumption to defeat it in marriage is going to be much greater than the presumption to defeat it with lunch encounters in your restaurant. Agreed. But notice, even with lunch encounters, there's a presumption that needs to be defeated. We start with the idea that, you know, if you don't want to associate with certain people, you shouldn't have to associate with certain people, okay? But then it turns out that we have systemic problems with racism, right? The government has a responsibility, in my view, to make sure that all of its citizens are free and equal. And the only way they can ensure that there's satisfactory freedom and equality is to then tell people, you can't have a business which excludes blacks, okay? I'm fine with all of that. But notice, even in the case of a business, right, that we start with a presumption in favor of freedom of association. And we do this with the JCs, we do this with Augusta National Golf Course, all of these things which are less important than a marriage. And then I also like your analysis of New Zealand. It's a really big deal to be annexed, okay? And it's also not that big a deal if a few Australians slip through the cracks, right? But if New Zealand can't control their borders, right, then masses of Australians could move there, and that's a really big deal. In fact, masses of folks could move there and then in the subsequent plebiscite vote to merge with Australia. So,
Well, just to be clear, racism is a special case, a special combination. But I don't think a restaurant owner has, there's any sincerity about a restaurant owner's having a prerogative to check me out as somebody who wants to be a customer before letting me sit down at the table and order. So I guess that's part of the general view I have. But there's no general right to association. There's no general interest of that kind that deserves to be protected. Though there are some especially serious interests of that kind. But one that would exclude some people, not necessarily making flood, from coming just because it serves some significant interest of theirs. I don't see it.
yeah, good. So then we do disagree.
Okay.
So I take freedom of association to be one of the core liberal rights, and I'm not an absolutist about it, and there are going to be contexts in which it's defeated, and then you and I might disagree about whether I'm required to bake a cake for a gay couple for their wedding or not, and things like that. But I always start with a presumption in favor of freedom of association.
But you start with an uncomfortable awareness, no doubt, of freedom of association having been massively important in arguments for segregation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no.
And
Well,
the people saying exactly what you said about, you know, that you wouldn't necessarily invite somebody into your own home. These are not neutral claims. These claims resonate
Right.
in hideous ways.
right.
On this one? Okay, so
I have a question more so for Patty, and perhaps it as well. We were talking about the responsibility of the duties of states when it comes to admitting people, and also this distribution or doing your fair share. Thinking about the EU and Sweden and the different portions of refugees taken into that country versus other members of the EU. How, in real terms, I guess, do we decide when countries have done their fair share, or if there are alternative ways, like in opposition to admittance, is making up for that share?
Yeah, I mean, Sweden's a funny case because Sweden. So I'm Canadian. I said that. So in 2015 and 2016, the two kind of, aside from Germany, which was in a different situation, Sweden and Canada admitted the largest number of Syrians. Canada made everybody a citizen. The first round, I mean, it takes 4 years. So the first round of Syrians who came to Canada are now citizens. They're taking their oaths. The pictures are all over the newspaper again. Everybody cries. There's kids. It's very moving. And the Swedes are starting to kick people out. So they didn't give them citizenship, and now they're asking them to leave. They're saying that the asylum claims are no longer valid, that temporary visas that they had are being restricted. So it used to be the case that everybody's saying, Canada, Sweden, Canada, you could do so much more. Look, so homogenous welfare state Sweden has let in 150,000, 200,000 people, and you've only let in 25 or 30,000. And then it switched because we're keeping ours. And Sweden is trying now systematically to kick people out. So how should we think about that? Right? So there's one question is I'm not going to answer your question, really, but one thing to think about is when you think the duty has been met, right? So if you're trying to think of seriously how you would construct an algorithm that takes into account GDP, population size, general tolerance of a population towards diversity, right? What are an algorithm, I'm married to a physicist, he always says an algorithm is just a calculation, but algorithm makes you sound smarter, so algorithm, right? So you got some stuff that you add in, and you get a fair shareness, right? But then there's actually a question of what looked like a fair share in 2015 and 2016, it looked like Sweden was doing much more than Canada. But down the line, it actually looks like we were doing different things. Canada was engaging in resettlement, and Sweden was giving temporary refuge. And so now we have to redo the calculation to try to understand whether duties were met and whether they continue to be met in these kinds of cases, right? So the question, so that's just a thought about Sweden. And the more general question of you know, how would you construct an algorithm and make sure that people do their part? I mean, this is a philosophical question, which is to say, mostly philosophers think, I think, that something like dealing with costly burdens, I don't think refugees are burdens, but they're often talked about as burdens, but you know, they do impose at least short-term costs. So there's a question, like the reason that people aren't doing their bit is because they think that other people aren't going to do their bit. So it's a collective action problem, right? And so if you could just find a fair share that said, Sweden, you admit this many people for this amount of time, and Canada, you admit this amount of people for this amount of time, and the United States wants to export justice, so it's going to construct safe havens in a Kurdish area, right? And then if everybody was doing their bit, then if everybody thought that everybody else could be assured of doing their bit, everybody would do it, and we could solve the problem. Right, so that's also not answering your question, but it's saying that the thought experiment of philosophers is try to imagine perfect compliance. What if everybody does their bit, and now let's take seriously space, resources, tolerance, willingness, and we'll come up with a number, and then we'll have a conversation. Right? That's have a conversation. I can't. So those are all the different ways in which I will not answer your question.
I also cannot answer your question. It's a very important, very practically pressing question. How do we determine what the share is, right? Each state is left to its own to determine it. Each state is radically underestimating and then failing to meet what it sets out to. So I think there are objective answers. They might be a little bit indeterminate, but if, in the real world, we're probably not going to get close to doing it unless we have some kind of way to solve the assurance problem. The traditional political story has been force, opposite Leviathan. That's not going to work, and so it's unclear. I think it's going to be tragically undersecured for the foreseeable future.
Okay, when you started, you mentioned how you move between ideal normative philosophy and the reality of the world. Based on that, I have a question for actually all three speakers about moving towards a more multidisciplinary study of immigration and the refugee issue. For instance, when we look at it from the perspective of historians, sociologists, or people on the ground, for instance, when your ideas were tested from the perspective of the world historian, I mean, the concept of the legitimate state is very shaky. I mean, maybe there is really not a legitimate state when you really look at it from the longer perspective of world history. And similarly, when we look at the work of the anthropologists working on the ground, for instance, as someone who did some work, oral history work with former refugees, the general conclusion that I get is that most of them are tired of being the object of discussion rather than the subject of discussion. And the question of what are the rights and duties to resettle may change. I mean, it may not be the winter jacket that's what the refugee needs. So how do we really, where's the voice of the refugee in your method? So how do you get to the voice of the refugee?
So I appreciate this question because the real and true answer is that this worried me greatly, and so I've been running a project now for about 4 years in which that's exactly what we're doing. And so my account of what resettlement is, the duty of resettlement, what we do when people arrive and are intending to, because they have no other option, integrate fully into the community, what is it that they are owed? And so that slide, which has 4 parts, is informed by their voices. We spoke to about 150 refugee and refugee families in the greater Ottawa area to try to get a sense of what is that the Canada was doing right, but what is it doing wrong? What is the contribution? How should we understand what they need, what refugees need, and how can they shape the future of refugee policy for additional people who come? And honestly, the things that people say are exactly as you would predict if you were smarter than me, right? But here's something that refugees don't know about: electric stoves. The vast majority of people who come in need of refuge have used gas stoves or no stoves, and so you actually the number of electrical fires caused by stoves in Canada has gone massively as a result of the influx of people from the Middle East, just because they don't, so that's part of trying to hear their voice, to try to understand what it is, try to get outside of what well-meaning white people like me think refugees want, to try to listen to their voices and take it seriously, what it means to bring people into a community when they actually don't want that. That's not what they want. They didn't intend to be needing new winter coats. That's not what they intended, right? So there's a real exercise in trying to construct a community in a space where where the voice of what is provided, what is provided to refugees is informed by their voice. Is that, you didn't even nod at me, so that makes me think I didn't answer your question.
Sorry.
Okay. You're not. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I would have found it helpful, I think, at every stage in Patty's presentation to have heard more about what the basis of the various claims was. I think there's a danger when we do sort of applied ethics that we just speak in a normative voice from start to finish. And I think philosophy can be most useful when it's more reflective than that, and where people stand back a little bit rather than simply announcing, I expect you'd all like to know what I would do if I ran the world. And here's what I would do in the second best case, and here's what I would do in the first best case. And the whole thing is sort of in that tone. I believe myself that we open up best to other disciplines, whether it's anthropology or ancient history or political science or whatever, when we do what philosophers are trained to do, which is not just to come up with normative pronouncements, but to reflect on things and to think a little bit deeply about what humans have been doing over the ages and so on, rather than just, look, there's a policy crisis now, and here's what I think we all ought to do about that. I mean, it's an admirable thing, and in a way lawyers have to do that, and people making law reform proposals have to do that. But I don't necessarily hear that philosophers, that their primary responsibility is coming up with purely normative statements.
I have a question to myself.
I think you should answer it.
No, I seek your help, especially to you, but so I want to go back to your beginning, your example of living, where people are appearing on the horizon and not moving. So we were very quick to agree with you, including Kit, that the right to property should be protected. You can't just, take my cows away or settle in my living room. We were very quick to agree that personal safety, things like that are protected. Great. But a lot of people, not me, I'm really playing the devil's advocate here, but just partly because I'm not sure I have a good answer. I would like to have a good answer. So, but a lot of people come and say, look, but this is extremely narrow-minded. People care about much more than their cows and haystack and their physical safety. They care about their religion, they care about their friendship, they care about the character of their community, what kind of relations there are, about the kind of things that build up solidarity. So why aren't those grounds of exclusion? Saying, no, just as you cannot take my cow, you can't take away my comfort with my religion.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah. I mean, David Miller has made an argument. You're channeling David here. Yeah.
God knows why, because I don't agree with it.
Right, but it has to be answered.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing, it sounds most plausible when the point is put in terms of culture, because we talk about culture now when we are nervous about talking about other forms of solidarity. We talk about language rights when we're nervous about thinking about other forms of solidarity. people maintaining the rights of the Quebecois used to maintain the distinctiveness was religious. Yeah? But people got very uneasy about that, and no, it's about being francophone, or it's about a particular culture, a particular set of dances, a particular set of rituals. And I think it's interesting that we wouldn't argue for a moment that a community is entitled to protect its religious homogeneity by throwing rocks at, say, Protestants who come into the neighborhood. We would think that, and that's a form of culture that matters more to most people than any other form of culture which we would use in a David Miller type argument. Secondly, I don't think that there is a respectable notion of treasuring one's culture which involves insulating it from outside impacts. I think that normative, I mean, if we're going to be normative about it, then the cherishing of the culture is cherishing a fabric of relationship, ritual, language, history, and so on, which is open rather than closed. So I'm nervous about the value of a closed culture. And thirdly, and it goes back to some of the Sedgwickian associations, in many ways, large modern democracies are not cultural communities, but some cities and regions within large modern democracies are cultural associations. But we wouldn't think for a moment that we're entitled to restrict movement among sub-territory cities, particular areas of farming communities and so on, so that we say, look, there's something distinctive about the way in which agriculture is conducted in Indiana among the Amish and so on. But it doesn't mean that we're entitled to restrict the movement of people to that part of Indiana. So in the two areas where cultural claims might seem most compelling, number one, where the culture is a religion, and number two, cultures within a particular community, we wouldn't for a moment countenance any restrictions.
Although to channel Abigail's question, you might say that if a particular culture is highly vulnerable to insiders, you might say that that's actually the strongest claim, right? This is the claim that gets made in Canada with respect to Aboriginal communities, which are perhaps uniquely permitted to say you can't live on our land. And we sort of accept that, even though movement and even though freedom of association, but we say, actually, white people cannot live on Aboriginal land, and we defend that with respect to something like cultural vulnerability or colonial oppression or something like that. So that, I think,
I can see the case that
yeah.
might be made for that.
Yeah. All right. I think
Are we done?
we should thank everybody.
Thank you.